Like any good guy born around the 2000s, I have a really strong connection with Spider-Man. I learned to love Tobey's third movie after everyone said it was garbage, and not just because of the funny dance scenes. I witnessed the chaos of Sony's plans with Andrew's duology, and I was even there for that whole Spider-Man cinematic universe they tried to make work several times but couldn't. And if you're like me, you'll know that even in the worst universe, with those terrible movies, we can always count on Spider-Man to never give up in the face of adversity. The city of New York will always end up appreciating its masked neighbor, no matter what J. Jonah Jameson says. And above all, Uncle Ben taught us that with great power comes great responsibility. Well, in almost every universe. With Brand New Day, they finally show us what Spider-Man would look like standing next to the other great Marvel heroes, along with his transition from Iron Man's protege to a hero in his own right. But interestingly and passionately, out of all those complex concepts they've shown us throughout the movies, one of the simplest, smallest, and most vital parts of his story was for a long time ignored: Uncle Ben. If you're a fan of the MCU, you're probably already at your keyboard, typing like crazy, some kind of response to the video, or what really happened to him. But maybe you should wait a bit and finish watching the video, because today, we're going to talk about the real tragedy of Benjamin Parker, and the real reason behind his disappearance, including that scene from Brand New Day. Okay, I know the title of this video might be hard to believe, so I think the best way to start would be with the irrefutable facts. Just a heads up, there are spoilers for a couple scenes from Brand New Day. It's clear that, with more than 10 years since a character's first appearance on screen, many of the twists we've seen so far weren't planned. So when we meet Peter in Civil War, he seemed to be written under the same rules as everyone else. Specifically, the tragedy that would define his character. He tells Tony Stark directly, "When someone has the abilities that I have, but others don't, and then something bad happens, it's on them." This is a phrase that shows the enormous guilt the boy carries despite his young age, implying that something horrible happened and he wasn't able to stop it. The Russo brothers, who shaped his debut in Civil War, commented that Uncle Ben did die, but that Peter doesn't blame himself for it. Something that shows us that, unlike the original canon we're used to, in this case, it really seems that Ben's death wasn't a turning point in Peter's life. In fact, they even went so far as to say that, at least according to them, Uncle Ben died in a car accident within the universe that Peter had little or nothing to do with, which means it was a normal family loss, and not as dramatic as what has happened to other Spider-Men. This is an idea equally shared by the writer of Homecoming, the movie that established Spider-Man's presence in the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe. He reaffirms the existence of Uncle Ben around the Parker household, not only from the line, "After all, because of what she's been through," that Peter says about May to avoid revealing his identity, but also many other scenes that were deleted, mainly one that was cut, where he used his Uncle Ben's suit for the dance. The sad thing is that from this moment on, mentions of Ben became less and less frequent and important. And in the next movie, the main reference to him was his initials on a suitcase. And ironically, he's only mentioned by name in the animated series What If, where a Peter from a universe similar to the MCU, but where a zombie virus arrives, explicitly mentions Uncle Ben. This allows us to imagine that, despite how important he was to our hero, he never represented the same bond as with Tobey's or Andrew's Spider-Man, especially after Tony Stark came into his life and took on that mentor role. Continuing with the movie timeline, when we get to No Way Home, there's a very small moment that many people overlooked when the movie came out. When everyone gathers to support Peter when on the rooftop after May's death, the other Spider-Men talk about the loss that marked them, with Andrew mentioning Gwen and Tobey mentioning Uncle Ben. Something that, interestingly, doesn't provoke any kind of reaction from the MCU Spider-Man. Once again, cementing that his relationship with his uncle never really blossomed, even though we know it did exist. With this, I want to present something cruel that this universe has made clear to us from the beginning. Uncle Ben takes up very little space in his mind. He does love him, but never had the connection the character is known for, which we'll need to remember throughout this video. Here we get into the complicated section. After all this, how does Doctor Strange's spell actually work? Because it sounds like something incredibly complex. He talks about a memory wipe, which really doesn't make sense. Think about it for a second. Strange mentions that it's the runes of Kof Kol, or in other words, a simple memory wipe spell. But if they only erased your memory, it would remove your recollection of it, but not the records, the photos, the videos, and all the evidence someone leaves of their existence. Something that definitely happens with Peter Parker. In fact, if we go as far as to add what the new movie has shown us, those affected don't have any kind of memory or thought about Peter at all, beyond the most primitive instinct of the human body, which would be muscle memory. This shows that it must be something more than just erasing memories, and that Stephen must have somehow erased absolutely everything that was under the mask, as if it had never existed. Of course, most likely, that wasn't the original idea. As we know, when Strange and Peter first try to create that mind-erasing spell, Strange is interrupted by Peter, which complicates the whole process. And it's precisely from this moment that the whole theory is born. Thanks to a question that, since I first saw the movie so long ago, I was never able to answer. And even in the new movie, there's no logical explanation that satisfies me. Why would a mind-erasing spell cause extra-dimensional incursions? No, seriously, I urge you to watch the scene again, and you'll see that within the simple phrase, "Now no one will remember that Peter Parker is Spider-Man," there's simply no room for the multiverse in that. Some will say this is because it's a powerful spell that rewrites time and space. We'll come back to that in a moment. But if that were the case, only this reality should collapse when the spell fails. It shouldn't weaken the barriers of the multiverse. If you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it's ridiculously obvious something doesn't add up. Now, we need to understand that Stephen himself mentions that it's complicated to stop a spell while it's being cast. But let's take a moment to see how the magic works. When it's mentioned that no one will remember Spider-Man, you can see a simple line surrounding them. When MJ is mentioned, a second line appears, which is joined by 2 more, belonging to Ned and Aunt May. This way, we can confirm that it's these people, these exceptions, added to such a complex spell that end up destabilizing it. But what exactly would cause such a powerful sorcerer to end up losing control? Well, any kind of alteration to reality can cause complications and domino effects. Using this case as an example, when it comes to human connections, the longer they last and the stronger they are, the harder it is to completely erase those memories that involve people who shouldn't be affected. In other words, Strange is trying to alter thousands of different events that led to decisions in the lives of MJ, Ned, or Aunt May, which would be completely impossible to justify without those important consequences. All these little details make this process exponentially more complicated, especially because he has to make them work with everyone else's memories. And the destabilization happens because what Strange was actually looking for were weak points within Peter's life. Decisions he could affect or modify that would allow only certain people to remember his identity. And of course, it's easier if he just has to erase everyone's memory. But adding these exceptions into a reality-altering spell at the last second and while he's casting it makes everything much more complicated. If you're watching this with a Spider-Man fan, give them a hug. We're about to discuss One More Day, one of the character's most hated comics that gives anyone who knows the context a serious stomachache. In this abomination, Peter agrees to give Mephisto his marriage in exchange for Aunt May's life. His marriage is an abstract concept, but what it really means is changing time so that he and MJ were never married. A big change in the timeline that has many more small changes than it seems. For example, because of this, now Harry Osborn, who hadn't died, survives. And it's explained that Spider-Man never got married because some guy hit him on the head. In fact, everything changes, to the point that actually, the one who cast the memory erasing spell was Dr. Strange. The comics make it very clear, when something from the past is erased or changed, things never stay the same. Something must fill its place, no matter how minor the change. That's when we return to the multiverse. Remember that this movie was originally supposed to come out after Multiverse of Madness, with Strange knowing more about the universe and its rules, and with a prominent appearance by America Chavez causing multiversal chaos. And considering what is known about the multiverse at this point, and that the spell has to do with these other universes, it's clear that Strange had a hard time finding a point of divergence that fulfilled what Peter wanted. Looking around the other timelines, some kind of inspiration from his other lives to alter reality. Something that ended up causing the incursions because he literally took pieces from other universes to fulfill Peter's wish. Again with the rings representing all the elements and lines he had to maintain. It's clearly impossible to achieve, with Peter beside you, urging you to change your spell as you try to prevent realities from collapsing. That's why when Steven comes face to face with Peter at the end of No Way Home, the solution to save reality is for everyone to forget who Peter Parker is. Because the villains from the multiversal incursions were coming for him, because they knew that Peter was Spider-Man in all the other realities. But Steven says something very important about this solution. It will be as if you never existed. Maybe, at first, it really was just a simple memory wipe. But we have to take into account the scenario where multiple enemies from different universes are now approaching to destroy New York in search of Spider-Man. Avengers-level threats, or even worse. As we saw in his solo movie, many variants of Doctor Strange are capable of making huge sacrifices for the good of the multiverse. And we even saw how far he went to contain Wanda, so I wouldn't be surprised if, to make sure this never happened, he made a tragic decision. This leads to the main question of the video, and why we uploaded this conspiracy theory. Why the hell, in the entire MCU, have we never seen Ben's grave, not even when they buried May Parker? And why does it seem that now, without his aunt, Peter remembers that important person even less? Having seen all this evidence, we have a pretty obvious answer. If we assume that Uncle Ben was a relatively private person who mainly interacted with May and Peter, the people he lived with, then after May's death, and if Peter Parker was erased from all of reality, there really wouldn't be much left of the memory of Ben Parker. Because everything related to Peter was erased, including his shared life since May and Ben took him in. And if we go back to that phrase from Strange, saying it would be as if he never existed, we come across the horrible reality of Strange's spell. He rearranged the documentation, the memories, the relationships, and Peter Parker's entire family history. Tony and Peter never met. Edith's glasses disappeared without a trace. Ned never had a best friend. MJ never had a boyfriend. Happy doesn't remember him, and there is no record of Peter anywhere anymore. For everyone, all these events happened as if Peter never existed. And if Ben's existence depended so much on a boy who never existed and a woman who died under strange circumstances, how much of his memory really remains? Maybe that's why May wasn't buried next to her husband. I don't think it's a continuity error or anything like that, but rather a sign that the past was changed in such a way that Ben Parker is no longer part of May's memories, or at least not in the same way. This is my most obvious and least conspiratorial answer, to the point that, in theory, I could end the video here. But if we wanted to go a step further, there's another possibility. An alternate theory you'll enjoy if you come to this channel for wild, outlandish ideas from the fifth circle of hell. If we get conspiratorial, those inconsistent points about Uncle Ben could be explained if we saw them as evidence that at some point he was someone more important to Peter. Much more important than what we ever saw, but his memory, and therefore what we've seen, would have been retroactively changed by Steven during the spell. We know that in the comics, precisely because Strange recognized the void Peter's uncle left in Peter's life. Strange was able to give Peter 5 minutes with his uncle. So it may be that, to make it easier for him to restart his life, he freed him from what he understood the least, reducing Uncle Ben to just a name. Odd references or Easter eggs in his life that he's come to ignore to make things easier for himself. But regardless of why, whether it was just a consequence of erasing Peter or something Strange did intentionally, the result is the same. Ben Parker has been reduced to a ghost. Just a couple of mentions and a suitcase with his initials. Honestly, no one in the world would notice that Ben Parker has supposedly ceased to exist. And the more the MCU denies it, the more his existence is ignored, the more it proves that at this point in the story, Benjamin Parker really no longer exists, just like Peter. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Relax if you did. Subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.